Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar. It's another warm day in Paris in a never-ending summer, but I was told that the cold is coming. We are very glad that so many of you have joined us today for what promises to be a very interesting conversation on the future of assessment. My name is Mario Piacentini, and I oversee the research and development program in PISA. With my team, we develop assessments of complex competencies that get included in every cycle of PISA, like the assessment of creative thinking, for which the results will come out in a few months. And assessment is the topic of today. Why is it important to talk about assessment? It is because assessment is the great gatekeeper in education. It's very hard to realize and implement any durable innovation, either in curriculum or in pedagogy in education, if you also don't change assessment. Because what gets assessed also tends to be the focus of instruction. We know we live in times of accelerated technological changes, and also, unfortunately, we are living right now through a very severe humanitarian crisis. All these changes call for reflecting on what we need to change in the focus of everyday instruction. However, what we know is that assessments are very slow to change. The type of assessment we use, the competencies we focus on tend to be, for students right now, tend to be very similar to the assessment the previous generation and the generation before them used. So why is change so slow? We discussed this issue in some depth in a recent publication that you will find in the chat that is called Innovating Assessment to Measure and Support Complex Skills. And we have the privilege of having a very distinguished panel with us today to lead our discussion and reflection on the future of assessment. We have today with us Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director of Education at OECD, the initiator of the PISA assessment. We also have with us Kadriye Ercikan, who is Vice President for Research at ETS, and Jack Buckley, Vice President of People Science at Roblox. So without all these people know assessment very well, but they have quite different perspective to share. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Andreas. So Andreas, please tell us your perspective on how assessment should be changing to serve better the needs of 21st century students. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you so much, Mario, and also thank you for your leadership in this field. I do believe this is so important. We've seen a fair bit of 21st century learning, but as you said, 21st century still has a way to go to catch up with this. And I would even argue, maybe one of the most consequential mistakes that we made in the history of education was to divorce learning from assessment. If you go back far enough in history, we all learned through apprenticeship. You always had someone telling you when something was going wrong on how to improve, and you were learning and assessment were two sides of the same coin. And then we industrialized education. We made you pile up many years of learning, and then one day we called you back and said, tell me everything that you have learned in all these years in a very constrained, contrived, sometimes artificial setting, and we called it an exam. And that actually had a trickle-down effect up to the early years of education. And but I believe today with technology, we have, for the very first time, that opportunity to remarry learning and assessment. And I do think there are just huge opportunities, and your work, Mario, I think is very much at the frontier of this. Let me just, share a couple of slides on this. And the first point I really want to make is that this involves some really tough and difficult choices. You want to assess a few things in great depth, or you want to assess a broad range of topics. And those choices have real consequences. We all know the difficult trade-off that we make between validity and efficiency. Do we want to assess a few things really well in the sense that they measure what we want to measure, or do we go for the cheap way and actually compromise some of that validity. And many of our assessments have actually traded in, validity gains for efficiency gains, because that's, how you save. There are issues around relevance and reliability. You want to have a very reliable test, you ask people 20 times the same question. It's not very relevant. But again, you need to make choices and trade-offs. The quality and scale of assessment. Now, it's easier to go in depth and improve quality when you have a smaller set of respondents, like a sample. If you want to go for the universe, again, scale gets into the way. A very kind of difficult choice to make is, to what extent you prioritize measuring trends whereas, being up to date with things. Now, some people say you cannot measure change if you change the measure, but if you don't change the measure, quickly out of date with what is relevant. So these are difficult choices, and education is a very conservative social enterprise. If you tell a parent, well, tomorrow you're going to change the exam for which you have prepared for 10 years, they're not going to be very happy about this. And that is, I think, a really, really tough issue. But when we look at learning, what I think is really, really interesting in the curricula of many countries today, aspects that are harder to capture in assessment, like critical thinking, like problem solving, like, effective learning strategies, like social skills, like, self-management, self-regulation, they actually play an increasingly important role in our curriculum and not often mirrored in an assessment, but they are part of the design of modern learning environments. So we should find ways to make them visible, because you're never going to improve what you cannot see. Now, that is, I think, clear to all of us. Now, the incentives that we set through the assessment will be very powerful. What's also interesting is that there have been some changes. When you look, for example, at upper secondary examinations, we see more performance tasks. We see more experiments. We see, some oral, tasks coming back. That used to be the norm. Then, we sacrificed those for, reliability gains. Now you can see that coming back, or answers in questions and so on. So it's been a little bit of movement. Clearly not as much as on the curriculum side, but some of that. And this is the big promise. We are now seeing basically computer-based assessment technologies becoming the norm. And of course, they hold huge promise. They allow you to make assessments adaptive. They allow you to make them much more relevant, much more interesting. Why would you test whether students know the result of an experiment when you can actually now give them a virtual laboratory to do that experiment and then assess why they are doing it? So there are huge opportunities in the use of new technologies in the field of evaluation assessment. As always, when you do something new, it's a little bit more expensive, but it just gets you a lot better information these days. We've even seen, a lot of efforts across countries to look at social and emotional skills. Sometimes, it's assessed explicitly, sometimes more implicitly. Sometimes you look at what happens in the classroom, what you can easily observe, but there are also interesting efforts to look beyond the classroom, service learning and so on, project-based learning that extend beyond the four walls of a classroom. So there are many efforts that countries make these days to somehow make those kinds of skills that are judged to be very important relevant. Probably, not in the most reliable way, most comparable way, but at least there is an effort to make them visible. And I would say that's actually a really, really important development. I want to, share one experience with you that I brought this whole agenda home to me. And it was actually before the pandemic in 2018. I was in a classroom in Shanghai and I saw how students learned calligraphy. And that is, one of the biggest headache of teachers there. We struggle in the Western world with 30 characters and they have to learn 4,000. So there's just a massive volume of material. And what's interesting is not just the technique, it's also an art for them. And while the students were drawing their characters, they had scanners integrated into their tables, and they had a tablet or a mobile phone on their desk that was giving them real-time feedback on the quality of the drawings, based on artificial intelligence and pattern recognition, comparing patterns across, thousands and 10,000s of students. They could find out, where students had misconceptions, where they had, made common mistakes. and they could give them that personalized feedback. No? These days, that is possible with technology, but the story didn't end there. Where it really got interesting to me was that, the teacher could see how different students were learning differently, where there, patterns of students making similar mistakes, needing extra help. They could actually ask the student with the most interesting solution or the most interesting misconception to come to the front and explain. So they couldn't just, randomly pick someone in the classroom, but actually work as a data scientist and look into this. And then afterwards, they work together to study, how to have different patterns worked out in different classrooms, in different schools. And you could suddenly see classroom observation was no longer just an art, but it became a science inspired by data. That is, just an example of what technology allows us to do these days. And it's not that technology gets into the way. The students were working in a very traditional way, drawing the characters, but technology was everywhere in the background. Watching, whether students get bored, whether they get interested, where they get stuck, where they advance, giving them that, personalized feedback. Very recently, I was in Korea, where students now have digital tutors. You get your homework, not just one size fits all, but actually, the assessment actually brings out, what works best for you and how you can, upgrade your knowledge in areas where you need to do this. And this really highlights why we need to better align, coordinate assessment system. And let me just, highlight one development that we do at the OECD, and that's the development of our PILA platform, complementing the kind of large-scale assessments that PISA provides. It's a more formative component. The future, this dichotomy between a summative assessment at the end and formative assessment through the process is really a dichotomy of the past. We now have the tools to bring those two worlds together. And that's exactly, what we're doing at the OECD, where we have, shared competency-based frameworks, data-driven feedback, and classroom-level experimentation, where teachers do not, have to design their own assessments from scratch, but they can use a kind of common toolbox to do that effectively. So, and again, one of the biggest crimes you can often make in an assessment is to watch what your neighbor does. No? People don't allow you that, or look up something in a dictionary or on Google. Well, that's what the real world actually wants you to do. The real world wants you to collaborate with others. The real world wants you to find out your own information. What we want to assess is not can you retrieve information, but can you actually think like a scientist, think like a mathematician. And therefore, this assessment is providing students quite intentionally with intelligent tutors where they can actually seek help. And if they are successful with this, we should applaud them, not criticize. It's equally important that students get a chance to actually reflect on their own progress. That's also something that we can now build into those kinds of assessment systems. At least that's what we're trying to do at the OECD. And then also, again, remarry the learning and assessment process. Of course, we need to see somewhere where students are to give them the right level of task, but then, rather than just testing them, give them, ideas, a tutorial of how they can develop a further set of competencies, and then, run them through learning activities that are meaningful. And then at the end, give them a challenge, and all of that in interaction. That's why young people love computer games. Computer games do exactly that. They have that learning and assessment, and it's all in interaction. You learn a lot about yourself. And why don't we do assessments in this way? So that's the idea. And at the end of the day, also, when we compare countries, not just look at whether how many students got a task right, but we can see about the levels of engagement. We can see to what extent students are actually self-directed in their learning approaches, able to monitor their learning progress, set their own learning goals, evaluate themselves, able to extrapolate from what they know, apply their knowledge in novel, unfamiliar situations, and last but not least, very important in assessment, persist. In the real world, we can't just, memorize solutions. Often we get stuck. We have to advance our thinking. And again, I believe that today we are in a position to do those things really well. And Mario, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. This was very, very thought-provoking. So now I'm turning to our other two panelists, Kadriye and Jack. You heard from Andreas on this, Andreas talked about the biggest mistake in education, divorcing assessment from learning. And this, I would say, is also one of the key focuses of our publication on innovating assessment. We are making the claim that we should bring assessment closer to learning. If we really want, and if we are interested to make valid claims on how well schools are preparing students for their future learning, for adapting to a world that we still don't know about. So I want you to reflect on this statement by Andreas and tell us what is your own take on the current state of play. What are like the challenges in terms of reliability, in terms of validity, in terms of fairness to all types of students, including students from different culture, related to this, to this paradigm change and this idea of changing the assessment experience. I will start from you, Kadriye. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Mario, and thanks for organizing this webinar. I am in a hotel room in Paris, and my computer keeps telling me that my internet connection is unstable. So I hope it's coming through okay. And if it doesn't, let me know, and then I'm going to switch to my phone hotspot. So thank you for very enlightening comments, Andreas. Yes, assessment has been divorced from learning in many contexts, though there has been greater emphasis put on the role of assessment more directly supporting learning. And there is it's a critical time for us to rethink assessment for a variety of factors. And I'm going to highlight a few other things in addition to the challenges that separation of assessment and learning creates. And in particular, I'm going to highlight 3 significant factors that are at play that really require us to rethink all aspects of assessment. So the first one I want to highlight is the concerns about assessment not assessing knowledge, skills, and competencies of individuals from a variety of backgrounds well. Because assessments are not being grounded in cultural contexts of individuals. And there are also some concerns around some uses of assessments not serving equity in societies around the world. An example of this is use of assessments in admissions decisions. So concerns about what assessments are able to do in this day and age and how they are used and interpreted and the consequences of those uses. So that's one key factor that really puts assessment at a critical juncture. The second factor that I want to highlight is the technological advances that require rethinking of many aspects of assessment, including what is assessed. In the context of AI tools such as ChatGPT, how do we think about writing skills or in writing assessment, problem solving, scientific reasoning? How do we, in this context, how do we define these competencies in ways that are aligned with the way that they develop and they are practiced in real life, in social life, in learning, in careers? So there's a significant acceleration of technological advances that really challenge all aspects of assessment, including what we assess. We also need to rethink about how we design and develop assessments in this technological context. Given the opportunities created by technological advances for interactivity, automation, opportunities for immediate feedback, that is really critical for closer connection between assessment and learning. What are the possibilities for designing tasks that facilitate assessment of what matters? And this is what really was highlighted in the book that Mario and Natalie edited. How do we assess what matters? Not what's most convenient and most efficient, but how do we assess what matters in our technological context, assessing complex skills. And in context, in what's referred to in the book as in authentic context, in context that individuals are expected to use those skills, not in an abstract way that we have created in assessments for efficiency purposes, and in ways that really optimize engagement and provide direct benefits to the individuals. And the third factor I want to highlight, I mentioned three. The third factor is really the changing demands for complex skills. Skills needed for learning, skills needed for social life, skills needed for careers. And some of these skills did not even exist 5 years ago. That require use of knowing how to use AI tools, as an example. Skills needed for everyday life, education, and careers include communication, collaboration, decision-making, learning. These now have different flavor. They have different ways of integrating technological tools that require not only create efficiencies in these skills, but also require knowledge and skills for using those tools. Excuse me. The other thing I want to highlight is that since we have colleagues around the world focusing on assessment, what's changing is that all of these complex skills integrated with technological advances are almost certainly multidimensional and multidisciplinary. So meaningful assessment of these skills require grounding them in authentic and meaningful context, that is the context of social life, learning, and work. So how do I see assessment going? The direction of assessment, I really think that assessments need to be tailored to individual social, cultural, and educational contexts, align with their backgrounds, so they are personalized. They involve doing, demonstrating competence rather than regurgitating what individuals know. They are interactive and provide access to multiple resources for solving complex problems. And they are multimodal. They include text, written text, images, drawings, audio, speech, and video, and responses. Therefore, the responses to assessments are multimodal. Of course, we know that how we make sense of assessments is through measurement models. So we need to go beyond the typical measurement models and develop models that include processes, responses, speech, images as evidence of the construct, not just what's been written as a solution to the questions. This all requires rethinking of foundation of assessment and measurement and a need to create a new paradigm for assessment.
Thank you very much, Kadriye. Now, Jack, like Kadriye has covered a lot of ground, so not necessarily in this order, but she has spoken about the need for changing the focus, like so the type of skill that we assess, changing the how we assess, so integrating technologies to recreate, to simulate situations that resemble authentic problems and authentic work and life context, and also the issues about measurement and innovating the measurement models to tell more about the students and also make claims that can be defensible in this very complex field that are all these 21st century competencies and so on. So I would like you to focus maybe more on the technological aspects, since you know a lot about technology. You have designed a lot of new interesting tools. So can you tell us your take on the future of assessment, Jack?
So both Andreas and Kadriye have covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot there, almost everything that I agree with to a great extent. I think I similar Kadriye to what you said. I tend to organize my thinking into at least three areas. So there's the what are we assessing, which in many cases are constructs or domains that we've always needed to assess or we have for a long time, and those won't change. Then I think the second piece there are areas of those domains that we have historically maybe not assessed because it was difficult. And to both of you made the point that it's very easy sometimes just to go measure what's easy, and knowing that you're leaving something out, but really not doing anything about it. So for example, scientific reasoning in the context of a science assessment has always been harder than simple science facts. And so it's not that we just discovered that reasoning is important to science, it's that we knew it and we didn't want to go through the trouble of assessing it for a bunch of reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about later. And then there are newer domains, and again, these may not be new to humans, like collaborative problem solving is not a new idea, but the idea that it might be taught and measured in education is relatively new. I think the next question, Mario, where you're leading to is the how. And again, I want to be clear, and most folks, I can see great comments in the chat about this too. A lot of us, myself often included, default to technology to start having this conversation because we're deeply enmeshed in trying to build new technologies and new ways of assessment. But in many cases, there are interesting examples, maybe dead ends from our past as a field, where we used older technologies to try to get at some of these same constructs. And it's worth remembering that, because often, even though they seem highly correlated, right, when we look at new digital technology, it opens up new avenues for assessment. There's probably somebody who tried to do it with old technology. So for example, people have been giving adaptive assessment with pencil and paper for decades, simply by having a human score the first round of tests and then hand out the right form for the next round. The National Assessment of Educational Progress program in the United States gave hands-on science task assessment, standardized national science tasks where they actually mailed kits of laboratory equipment to 12th graders to conduct scientific experiments that were standardized and scored and measured as part of the national assessment. That seems antiquated, but the idea was to get at people doing real science in a standardized fashion. So where does technology come in? In a lot of cases, it should reduce the cost to doing things like that. It should also increase the scope and scale of what you can measure. So for example, an experiment that might take months to realize results, you can speed time through a simulation. It's much easier to do that technologically. And then I think there's some areas that the technology enables that just, again, it might be possible to think of a way to do it without digital technology, but the experience would be so inferior that students are so used to the technology in the rest of their lives that bringing them back to not use it for the assessment would be horrendously inauthentic. And so that's where I think some of the work that my team has been doing around game-based assessment is just one example, where if we want to measure some aspects of either new things like relatively new constructs like creative problem solving, or even old things, scientific basic facts and scientific reasoning, it can be a lot more engaging and interesting to do that in a game. It can be it's a way that meets students where they are and collects data in new ways, right? So to the last point, or well, let me make one other point. The third area, and I want to come back to this because I do agree, Andreas, with your point. For most of us, for most students' experience, most of the time, I think the future is a better integration of learning and assessment, better formative assessment, seamless interim assessments that help diagnose where students are. There will be cases, though, still probably forever, that require summative assessment for different purposes, and those assessments will be somewhat divorced from from learning. It shouldn't be divorced from the content that was learned, but sometimes for selection, to different kinds of programs or employment, which is where I spend a lot of my time now, selecting people for employment, the employer is simply not interested in understanding how the student got there. They just want to know, can they code? And so I don't want to throw away the idea of summative assessment, but I agree, I think, with my co-panelists that the future for most of our efforts will be involved in sort of integrating those two areas.
Thanks a lot, Jack. Yes, you made a very important point about like the fact that we need to achieve at least some consistency between what is done on a formative level in the classroom and what will be a remaining need, at least for some time, that will be summative assessment. Before I get back to Andreas, I realize I neglected one of my duties. I should encourage you to participate and put your questions on the chat, because we will have time after another round of questions to get to your own questions. So let us know what you think about assessment, what you like, what you don't like. I see that there is a lot of interesting discussion going on right now. Now back to you, Andreas. You are among us like the person who spend more time speaking with high-level policymakers, and so what I wanted to ask you, you say that you have seen in many countries like Korea a lot of things going on, a lot of things changing, a good integration of technology. So why, at least at the summative level, at the large scale level, we see so much resistance to change? Is it because of the cost of developing this kind of immersive and more technology-oriented things? It's because the reliability concern that you also mentioned. What are the main resistance to change, and how do you think we can at least like address some of those?
Yeah, the argument of cost is sometimes made, but that's really silly. We spend millions on people, on education, and if an assessment costs $20, $30, $50 per person, that's still a really good investment. So I think the cost argument is just a matter of us not making effective spending choices. So that's easy to win. The harder ones are, the higher the stakes in an assessment, the more difficult it is to prioritize validity over reliability. And I can name ministers of education who lost their job because someone contested the exam. And this is just very difficult. If you can lose an election over education, you're not going to win an election over education, just because it takes a lot of time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. So I think it is tough. The political economy of advancing assessment is not easy. The second problem you run into is your client base, parents. They prepare their kids for a goalpost that is agreed early, and suddenly you go there and say, oh, by the way, you did all of this for nothing. We just changed the assessment yesterday. So again, have a very conservative client base that is very much looking for consistency and predictability in educational experiences. And last but not least, I want to put teachers also in that camp. It is when we encounter dramatic change around us, we always resort to the things that we know how to do best, and it is much easier, as a teacher as well, to administer a kind of simple efficiency-driven assessment based on standardized response types. It takes hard work for teachers to engage with real good formative assessment. That is actually, you see actually many poor examples, but actually it's really hard to do that, well. Now, none of that should stop us. And I do believe, and Jack made many of those points, that technology offers, a good answer to many of those questions. It can offer you a fair amount of standardization with personalization. I think that combination wasn't possible in the past. In the past, you had to make very cumbersome choices. Today, we can actually, have something like, I would call mass customization. You use a kind of standardized tool, but you still offer a kind of very personal experience. And I also, like Jack said, you'll always have, summative assessments, but even those can become, portfolio based. They can actually look at, learning experiences over long periods of times and so on. So I do think, we will actually get good answers to this. The harder challenge is, the conservative nature of the education enterprise. That is really difficult to change. You need to convince parents that, the world has changed, that you better prepare. And I think the lower we can make the stakes of the assessment, the more likely it is that we're going to see a real change in this. And some areas, if you go beyond schooling, I mean, in some industries have actually done really well. I must actually say I've been more encouraged by assessment and exams in the vocational sector, career and technical education, than in the academic sector, because there people know, you need to know certain things. It's the relevance that drives this, rather than the kind of the universities are often the guardians of very conservative ways of thinking. So I think you see good examples. The technology sector also has been really, really innovative in rethinking assessment. So I think they're promising signs, but it takes political courage, and I would like to see more of that.
Thanks, Andreas, for this reflection on the complexity of change in a very sensitive political context. So you mentioned something that I want to call Kadriye on the importance of making assessment fairer by increasing the level of personalization in the assessment. Kadriye, you work at ETS that has shown us how to produce high quality standardized assessment. So, but you also talk a lot about personalization. So this is something very challenging for me to reconcile. Can we have reliable standardized assessment that allow for some degree of choice and personalization? What is your thinking on that?
I was really happy to hear Andreas refer to personalization as key to really making the connection between assessment and learning. And it goes, for me, personalization goes beyond that, just providing the feedback for individual, but that's really an important aspect of it as well. I think that if we want to do good measurement, that is accurate estimation of competencies and an appropriate interpretation and use of assessment, we really need to advance personalization, different types and degrees of personalization. I recognize the puzzle around the whole standardization and the whole measurement field really being tied to testing groups. This includes our key concepts in measurement, validity, reliability, fairness. These are all defined conceptually and statistically at the group level. These are really group level statistics. So we evaluate qualities of measurement, qualities of tests at the group level that we know for sure don't necessarily apply to individuals. So a validity, strength of validity evidence for at the group level does not necessarily apply or even measurement accuracy. And we know this much more simply than validity and fairness issues. Measurement accuracy, for example, the concept of reliability is at the group level, and depending on the individuals, where they are on their proficiency levels, we know that measurement accuracy estimate does not apply well. So there's a lot, I mean, and the field has been aware of this for a very long time, and there is recognition of that, but the challenge is, how do we do it? How do we go in the direction of personalization that really, on one hand, enhances this cultural responsiveness, aligns assessments to individuals' cultural, language, societal, educational context, but goes beyond that, also aligns assessments to individuals' personal preferences, personal backgrounds. That's not categorized around, demographic categorizations. So there has been a lot of research on culturally responsive assessment, on grounding assessments in cultural context norms and affirming identities of groups taking tests. I think it's really important to recognize the great diversity within any kind of typical demographic group. This is true for gender groups. This is true for language groups and cultural ethnic groups. There is a great diversity within these groups. So often what is identified as a strategy for cultural responsiveness of assessments, for example, cultural contexts, don't necessarily work for everyone within that cultural group. So I think focusing on the individual and aligning the assessment to the individual's background is critical for optimizing engagement and performance, as well as providing feedback that is really tailored to the individual. So how are we doing that? We're working on what it means to have the kind of claims that we want to be able to make in large-scale assessments like PISA and other large-scale assessments, as well as personalization. We're working on principles and methodologies for personalization. In fact, what does personalization mean? On what variables should personalization focus on? What really makes a difference for what kinds of contexts? Creating assessments that are based on equivalence of evidence, and this has been proposed by Bob Miss-Levy a few years back now. The field has been focusing on equivalence of observations based on the same assessment task or translated versions of adapted versions of the same assessment task, and creating comparability through that. Bob has provided a pathway for creating equivalence of evidence when the tasks may look different, but get at the same targeted construct. How do we extract equivalent evidence from those different looking constructs?
Thanks, Kadriye. Yeah. I think this is really interesting, and I think we could have a webinar just on that. I think the audience is pleased, like me, to hear that you are working on this. I saw in the chat that there was like a question on how do we avoid that assessment is perceived as a bad word, and I think the making assessment more culturally responsive would get us a long way to change perceptions and make that that everyone is assessed and evaluated on fair grounds. And Jack, going back to you, you're an expert in game-based assessment. You mentioned your team has been working on that. I saw like many interesting prototype and many applications. So there is also a question for you from the audience on whether you think that this works for everything, or it works better in some domains, or do you think that game-based assessment will be applied for everything, summative, formative, and in any domain, or do you from your experience in the last 10 years, you think that it works for some purposes but not for everything?
It's a great question. I would say from experience, it can work. It can be made to work for virtually anything, but it's probably not cost effective for a lot of things. So I started sort of in terms of the standards of validity, reliability, technical standards in the hardest area, which is high stakes selective assessment, which we still implement. So I think we've demonstrated that you can build game-based assessment that you can use for very rigorous selection. It's actually a lot more fun to build game-based assessment for formative, much more integrated in learning, and I'm happy to support a lot of that work as well. Usually when someone comes with a construct, some idea, something they want to measure, we'll listen to what they're talking about, and there are just some things aspects of algebra, for example. There are game-based assessments out there, but the development costs relative to more traditional assessment, even if you're just sort of integrating it digitally with your curriculum, don't lend themselves to building a game if you have finite resources. Andreas, I agree with you. It's sort of silly. Using cost as a barrier is silly in some ways, particularly in the policy level, when we're talking about the difference of tens of dollars, tens of euro versus 20s of euro. But on the development side, it can be the difference between 5 million and 500. And so some of these, I think we're missing. Let me flip the question around, Mario. What would make that problem go away? What would make game-based assessment or complex simulation-based assessment, or it doesn't have to be a game, right? So some other sort of high cost right now digital assessment modality would make that barrier go away. I think we are missing a level of intermediate infrastructure between the content providers, the people who understand what students need to know and be able to do, and the test makers. And that piece, it's similar in other domains, and usually what has historically recently has stepped into that infrastructure layer is some sort of platform company, right? It's some organized entity that thinks they can extract basically profit from owning that platform layer in between, and they're willing to put a lot of capital into that. I haven't seen that in education. There's not that infrastructure layer, and I think that's a key. Either it could be construed as a market failure. I think it's more like people haven't figured out that that's a necessary step, and they were just expecting the content folks to figure this out on their own. And so I do think if we could solve that intermediate layer, then the cost problem is vanishingly small, and you could basically use these methods to measure pretty much anything you wanted to.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. I'm glad you made the point about cost, because I'm also struggling in our own program to develop like more immersive simulations. It takes much more time and greater cost. I also agree with your point on the need to find a way to democratize like assessment, development, and production, and to create incentives for people to share code and solutions. I differently from you, I don't see it as a private market failure, but I would say it's more a failure of public policy. I think that if several countries would chip in and share and develop an open source solution that they can share together, we would get to this level of intermediate infrastructure. And this is what we are trying to facilitate with the PILA project that Andreas mentioned. So I've got a lot of questions from the chat. It's very hard to decide on which one. There is one that is quite interesting. So maybe Andreas, if you can tell us your perspective on, you said about we should open up assessment to feedback tools. What is your view on the AI? Will a generative AI will be the driving force that basically force us to change everything? Because if we do the standard knowledge-based test and people can use generative AI, it will simply not work. Is it a threat to the model? Is it an opportunity? What do you think?
Yeah, let me just say one more word on the cost aspect. I agree with Jack. We lack this intermediate infrastructure, but we have other sectors where that exists. In the medical sector, we have a huge industry that actually serves the public and is integrated into the public. Nobody would worry if we have to spend, $10 million on an NMR scanner, because it's actually providing very, very important information. So I really don't think the cost argument holds. It's a matter of how we design education, how we combine space, time, people, technology, assessment, learning in ways that are most conducive to effective learning. But on the question of AI, yeah, absolutely, it changes. The education no longer rewards you for providing answers. It is about your capacity to question the established wisdom of our times, not to reproduce it. I think that is very, very clear, and that has huge implications for assessment. just testing whether students remember certain answers. Actually, a couple of years, Israel went a very interesting way. They basically allowed students during the final exam to assess whatever tool they like. They could use the internet, they could use whatever. And it was actually a really interesting experiment. And it had actually not as big implications on outcomes than one would have imagined. It particularly helped students from disadvantaged backgrounds. For students from wealthier background, you didn't see that much of an effect. But I think that is the future. We need to get our assessments to look at aspects where we complement, not substitute, the artificial intelligence of our computers. And that is a huge challenge for the industries. But I do think that if we don't do that, we will educate second-class robots who are very good at reproducing, what we told them, but who are not, do not have the human skills that make them different.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Andreas. Jack, Kadriye, do you also want to react on this, on how ChatGPT and large language models are impacting your work?
I quickly, and there are so many great questions going by. I just want to say I apologize in advance because I know we're not going to get to them all. So I think education technologists right now are fixated on generative AI, both for good reasons, because there are some really important changes coming there, but also because of a hype cycle that we saw with Web3 and with every few years, and it's sort of ridiculous at some level. For our work, actually, to get back to the infrastructure question, one thing that I found already is sort of amazing is generative models have the capability to really reduce some components of that cost barrier. And so, for example, this is where again, having a platform that's willing to invest in training a generative model. Here, just take a quick, like in game-based assessment, one of the things you need to create are lots of digital visual assets. You need to make a lot of graphics. You need to make a lot of art. Historically, you needed a bunch of digital artists to do that. And that's not horrendously expensive, but it's much more expensive than what would normally the cost of item development in a traditional test. Generative AI for a very substantial investment upfront reduces the cost of that generation pretty close to zero. And so we've already seen the ability to take things that would have cost maybe $5 million a few years ago. We had to spend 300 to get it to work, but then once you've done that, that's a one-time cost, right? And you can generate that marginal cost is really very close to zero. So I think that the way I look at it right now is anything that does not have to be correct. Generative AI is excellent at reducing those costs, which is why I continue to be puzzled, and this is an aside, at some of the leading education technology folks, at least in the United States, who continue to talk about tutoring, which is the one area that has to be correct and strikes me as the very worst place to deploy a chatbot, but I may be missing something there.
Thanks, Jack. Kadriye, one very quick comment on?
Yes. Generative AI is transforming educational assessment from creating content for creating interactive tasks. We have an ongoing research around designing interactive simulation-based tasks efficiently using generative AI tools. So creating those tasks, evaluating responses, multimodal responses using generative AI tools, and creating feedback. And I agree with Jack that human in the loop or human addition to the machine-generated content feedback evaluation is really critical for things that accuracy matters. So stakes matter, but generative AI is transforming the educational assessment field.
Thank you, Kadriye. I hope that all the people working test developments are not too scared by these comments on the power of generative AI. But moving forward, I saw an interesting question in the chat. We discussed it about almost everything, but we didn't really take much of the student perspective into the picture. So do you know that one of the issues with assessment is that it creates a lot of pressure for students. It also creates a culture very much focused on grades and performance that might also have kind of several adverse psychological consequences. So do you think that this is also, do you think that this still matters, Andreas, when you travel the world and, for example, you go into a system in which you see, I was wondering if there are questions about that when policymakers think about assessment, if, translated to this new model in which we collect performance data on a continuous level on each activity through technology could also improve the life of students. Who wants to reflect on that?
Yeah, Mario, I'm not sure whether assessment here is the symptom or the cause. It is simply clear that in some societies, education has much higher stakes. And there, obviously, the pressure on students is high. Whether that is caused by the assessment or just reflected in the assessment is not so clear. But I would also see some positive sides in this. We have very clear evidence that educational outcomes are more equitable and usually better in education systems where the stakes are higher. Most high-performing education systems have very clearly defined goalposts. Everybody knows what counts, what matters, and students study hard to get there. And the system usually, gets everybody to that goalpost. So I think we should, not necessarily lower the expectations, lower the pressure. What we should probably do is redouble our support. Why do I say this? We recently looked at the social emotional outcomes, and we found that, Finnish students that are rarely exposed to tests fear at tests like nothing. Test anxiety is incredibly high. Korean students who get tested every day, they're pretty relaxed about it. It's just part of their life and they have to get through it, and they do get through it well. So, I worry that sometimes, making things easier and removing, what we see. I mean, I actually worry more about education systems that, leave it up to the very end and then students face the reality that they have never learned to see. So I'm not sort of convinced that lowering the stakes is going to increase student well-being. That's in a nutshell what I want to say.
Thanks, Andreas. And I think you're making a very important point that assessment needs to stay, and we need signposts for accountability and for helping students to learn. Now we have only 30 seconds left for each of you, if you either reflect on these well-being questions or if you want to make some kind of final statement. So I would, Kadriye, first.
I'll try to make this really quick, but I do want to highlight two things. If we want to make real changes in the learning outcomes we need to think of the bigger education system. Teacher practice, teacher preparedness for teaching these complex skills. Cost is one, stakes is another one, but I think we need to think of the bigger ecosystem around education if we really want to transform education. The other point I want to make is that we express a lot of excitement around generative AI, and I want to highlight that generative AI presents both great opportunities and some challenges, especially if we're talking about culturally responsive assessments, assessing individuals across from different cultural and language backgrounds, because generative AI tools are based on large language models that are really dependent, population and language dependent. So,
thank you. Jack, one last note.
I just one last here's a caution. I agree with everything Andreas said. I think that in addition to student well-being, which we need to always keep in the forefront, families will be concerned at the amount of digital exhaust that's generated by all these new approaches and systems. And so Europe, for example, is leading the way in protecting student data for the rest of the world, but a lot of us need to catch up. And if we don't, there will be unintended consequences of a lot of this measurement that could actually backfire and derail the entire endeavor. So there's an important role for government here in making sure that the data infrastructure itself is secure and private.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks a lot, Andreas and Kadriye, for staying with us. I saw that most people that connected stayed online. It means that you gave us a very interesting conversation. I wanted to thank you, everybody who joined us today. And we are always available for more questions. Also, thanks to the people who join us on YouTube, and more coming in the next weeks with the OECD webinar. Thanks a lot.